Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening. I'm Mike Ross. I'm an alcoholic. And I'm very happy to be here tonight. Why? Raise the mic. How's that? Well, you know, I've always known it. We didn't come here with a full string of lights, and it's getting bad every year. It's good to be here tonight. As I said, as a matter of fact, I'm very happy to be any place tonight. As a friend of mine says, I'm very happy to be here with clothes on and cleaned up and sound of mind and body and whatever you have. It's a hell of a group here tonight. While the young lady who was reading chapter 3, the 12 traditions, I'm sure all you fellas remember the girl who read the 12 traditions here. It flashed on me, people say to me, how come you still go to all those meetings? That's why I still go to all those meetings. I gotta tell you, when I came in, they didn't look like that. We had about 6 old broads, and there were about 60. Well, 55, give or take a year or two, you know. But isn't it strange? I just spent a week in Vegas, and that's terrible for an alkie who's not drinking anymore, you know. Because you step up to the blackjack tables or the crap tables, and I like to fool around with either one of those games, and there's always some broad tapping you on the back, so what do you have to drink, you know, and you have to think for a minute. And I say, bring me a pack of cigarettes. I got to get something for nothing, you know, I'm not just going to let it pass. And then as an added thought, I said, I'm plain tonic and lime, and they give you a double take. And I said, oh, that's plain tonic and lime, you know. I'm glad I had to come here from Vegas, because after a week in Vegas, you know, you need something like this to kind of settle you down. And on top of that, there was a golf game arranged for me this morning, and it was real nice, you know, it really was. I played with another fellow who had a few years of sobriety, and a newcomer with practically no humility at all. Son of a bitch, you get these smart-ass newcomers around here, and you know, really, it's amazing what a hole-in-one will do, you know. And then you got to go around for the other 12 holes, keep listening to this hole-in-one this guy made, you know. And I really don't care. I don't. But it was a lot of fun. That's the one thing I found. You know, when I first came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I wondered what I was going to do for laughs. I really did, because I always thought that when I was drinking, I had a lot of laughs when I was drinking. And but I'm finding that you get just as many, and you know, you don't wake up with that terrible feeling about what happened yesterday. Did anybody ever had that feeling? I wonder what happened last night. But it's been real nice. It's been, I marvel at every passing week, month, and year that I'm in Alcoholics Anonymous. To have friends wherever I go, and had a wonderful dinner tonight with some beautiful people, Hal and Margaret and Cliff and his lovely bride, and you know, you sit at a table and just cut up touches. And tonight, the birthdays, that's great, you know, 8 years and 7 years and 8 years, and I remember what it was like. When I was 8 years sober too, I thought, God, this is incredible, right? And then I listened to the lady tonight did an 8-year take, and she says, you know, it's incredible being sober 8 years. And I said to myself, oh, you're just a newcomer, you know. And tonight I reminded myself, and we had some conversation, that 30 years ago tonight I was winding up my last drunk. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was Derby Day. And that's what reminded me of it. I'd been drunk for 3 days and went to the Kentucky Derby and don't remember it. And I don't remember working I was an actor playing a nightclub. And I don't remember the last 3 days of our engagement, the Derby, or anything else. It's an amazing thing, and it's by God's grace that I stand here tonight before you as a solid citizen of the community in which I live. And it's been because of God's grace and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, as I found it in our big book of experience, that I'm here. And for this, I'm not only grateful, I'm very thankful. I'm thankful for the fact that I was able to follow a few simple directions, that I was able to read the black lines in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and not try to analyze them, but utilize them. And it was an amazing thing. It is. It's an amazing, just absolutely, it's impossible. Absolutely impossible. I come from you know, next week you're going to hear Tommy wailing. Well, you know, you figure he's an alcoholic, he's an Irishman, he's got an Irishman's disease. You know. What the hell's my excuse? I'm a Jew. And when someone told me I had an Irishman's disease, I said, well, it's about time we gave him a little class. I come from a family of 4 sons, and I'm the only one that's an alcoholic. My 3 brothers are very successful businessmen. A couple of them have families, and as I say, they're successful in every area of their life, and they drink. I don't know how they do it, but they drink. And, you know, they don't get in any trouble. And with me, from the time I took my first drink, that was a life for me. I loved it. I don't usually, I'm not going to give you much of a drunk-a-log tonight, despite the fact that our book tells us, our stories disclose what we were like and what happened and what we are like now. And I go back to what I was like, and I used to hear people talk about their childhood and what happened, and I could never figure out what my childhood had to do with my being a drunk. And after many years of sobriety, I began to look back into my past, and I found out that there was something there. When I was 13 years old, I was almost as tall as I am now. I was about 6 feet 2 inches tall, and I was very skinny. As a matter of fact, I was so thin that if I stood sideways in school, they marked me absent. And I could never figure out why there was so much difference between me and the other boys of 13, because they were down here. And then it dawned on me that I really never did feel comfortable with these kids because I could never feel a part of the group. And not only that, but as I began to recall, I remembered little things like we'd have fights, you know, and it was always somebody passing by when I was knocking a little kid down. They said, look at the big bully picking on the little kid. And then someday the little kid would get a lucky punch and knock me down, and the other kids would say, the big kid can't fight, let's all jump him. So, you know. Let's face it, folks, I was a born loser, you know, right from the beginning. Two very traumatic things happened to me when I was 16. When I was 16, well, only one really traumatic thing happened at 16. The other one wasn't too bad. It became sort of matter of fact later. But when I was 16, I had my first date with a girl. I say that because, you know, well, anyway, I had my first date with a girl, and I didn't know the girl, and I went out. My friend called me up, and he said, we're double dating tonight, and I said, who am I with? He said, I don't know, she's a friend of my girlfriend's. So we went out on this date on a Friday night, And at 16, you know, I was still 6'3" and, you know, thin and black hair and a lot of it, and I looked pretty good, I guess. And I went out, and that night, it was the story of my life. My friend got lucky, and I didn't. And about 10 days later, I was lucky, and he wasn't. Don't nudge. I'll tell you what it is later. It was strange. That's very funny tonight, but do you know when that happened? And he told me about it, and he asked me if I would go with him to the doctor, which I did. And in those days, medical science wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. And it was a very painful process my friend went through. And I kind of suffered along with him. But let me tell you what it did to me. Because I have one of those kind of minds that, well, you know, what kind of a mind it was, it got me here. I said to myself, I swore, I made a vow that it would never happen to me. I said, that will never happen to me. The hell with it. No way that's going to happen to me. You know, as a kid, you have to remember, I was an idealist. I really was. As a kid, when I was 16, I thought every kid had everything that I had that was 16. I lived in the South. I lived in Virginia. We lived in a beautiful neighborhood, and all the kids around where I lived, we all had the same things. And so I couldn't conceive of a 16-year-old kid anywhere else having anything that I didn't have. So anyway, I made a vow that that was not going to happen to me. Now, at 16, I also got my first drunk arrest. I was driving a Ford to Media, Pennsylvania, and I got drunk, and the Ford wouldn't drive, or something happened, and they threw me in a drunk tank in Media, Pennsylvania for being drunk in auto. And I was lazy, as 16-year-olds are, and I headed for the bottom bunk. And I never did that again. Now, you got to know that when you're an alcoholic, it's very important that you learn these things quick. You know, you want to, because you never want to get in any spots where, you know, it gets too bad. But these were the kind of things that happened to me when I was a kid. I decided at that same age that I was going to be an actor. I wanted to go in show business. Now, I got to be honest about this, folks. I didn't have any talent for show business, but all I knew was that I didn't want to work. You know. Now, that's an alcoholic trait. More so after we get sober than before we get sober. That ought to strike a nerve. And by chance, I got in the show business. As a matter of fact, the fellow who was responsible for me getting into the business was an erstwhile member of Alcoholics Anonymous, a member of the theatrical profession. He's doesn't go to meetings anymore, but he's you know, he's one of those fellows that we take our hats off to, because he was able to go out there and do the right about face, and he's not having any trouble. He's a damn fine guy. But anyway, I went in the show business, and I was going to become an actor. And when they mentioned me, they said, that kid's got more guts than talent. And that's the way it was in those days. But I fought it out, and I became an actor, and I continued to drink. The drinking was great. That was one thing I loved to do. I really loved to drink, because it seemed that when I drank, the booze did something to me that at 16 or 17, being 6 feet 4 inches tall, I felt a part of those other guys, of those other men who were like 19 and 20 and 21. And because the kids of 16 and 17 and 18 were still like this, and I'm way up here, you know, so I can't fool with them. I got to spend my time with the men. And there I was, and launched the show business. I had my next date at 22. These are just a few of the highlights of my career. Well, you see, it took me that length of time to figure out that maybe, it might be all right. I took this young lady out, and we went out, had a very nice evening, went to dinner, went to a nightclub, and really had a wonderful time. And after the nightclub, we did some dancing, and after that, we went to a very well-known restaurant on Broadway, those days known as Lindy's, where all the celebrities came to meet. And after the midnight shows, and we had a midnight snack and a few belts, and the celebrities would come in, and some of them knew me, would say hello. It was a big thing, and I'm making a big hit with this broad. And you'll find out in a minute how big a hit I was. And when it was all over, I took her home, and we got to her house, and I said, I certainly enjoyed going out with you tonight. I said, I had a nice time. She said, I like going out with you. And I'm glad you're back. She said, I like going out with you, and I got to tell you what my answer was, and when you hear it, you'll know that I was destined to wind up here. When she said that, I said, why? Now, most guys, when a young girl tells a fella she likes going out with them, right away the guy thinks about baseball. He says, I wonder how long it's going to take me to get to first base, et cetera, et cetera. But I just said, why? And she told me. She said, because you can take me to places where the other fellas can't afford to take me. She got out of the car and left. When I left, I said to myself, I was right. At 16, I knew they were no damn good, and they still aren't, 6 years later, I got the same feeling. And I decided then and there that there was going to be a vendetta between me and you. You being the women of the world, all of you. Whether I knew you or not, there was a vendetta. Didn't make any difference. And during the period of time that I did all this, I continued to drink and worked in show business. I was in a couple of shows. I did some musical comedy. I did a lot of different things, If you have nothing to do and you stay up and watch a late movie, you'll probably see me, nothing too modern, but it doesn't make any difference. I went into business, I continued on in show business, and I continued to drink, and I really drank because I really liked it. I'm not one of those guys who says that my worst day sober was better than my best day drunk, because I had some great days drunk. I don't remember many of them, but I had them, I had some great nights, too, yeah. I did all those things that everybody else did. And I continued to drink. I coast to coast, playing the upholstered sewers in different cities, and, wherever. Playing some nice places, too, But really, at 5 o'clock in the morning, have you ever seen an empty nightclub at 5 o'clock in the morning? It smells like an upholstered sewer, the stench of the booze and everything else. And I went to all these places. I played some theaters and did all these things. And I really had no goal in life, but I didn't care. The world was my oyster, and I was moving along in that fashion. And then came World War II. And I was under contract to a New York producer, and I was in a show. We were traveling on the road, and I got drunk in Washington, D.C., and decided to enlist because I couldn't understand, every time I'd be working in a show and there'd be some GIs in the audience, I kept thinking to myself, they're saying, what's that big son of a bitch doing up there when he ought to be with us, And so one Friday night I went out and I got drunk. And Saturday morning I passed the recruiting station. I went in and I was hungover and I enlisted. And this officer came out. He was a captain, and he said, fine. He said, we're glad to have you. I said, by the way, there's one little hang-up. I got to give my employer 2 weeks' notice, and I explained to him about being in a show, and I gave it 2 weeks' notice. I went to the theater that day, and it's something I'd been wanting to do for 3 months because I really didn't like the stage manager. And I did what every self-respecting drunk does. I walked into the show that day about a half hour before matinee time, and I walked up to the stage manager and tapped him on the back. And he turned around and he said, yeah? I said, you can take this show and shove it up your heart. I said, I quit. He said, why? I said, I quit. 2 weeks' notice. And I walked and went to my dressing room. I was dressing with a guy who was to come to Alcoholics Anonymous a few years ahead of me, and who remained sober until he died. That was Eddie Garr. And Eddie and I always had a bottle of scotch on our dressing table. And I went in the dressing room, poured a big hooker of scotch, and took it. And I said, well, I said, I'm on my last 2 weeks. And I told him, I gave my notice. And I went in the service. I went into World War II. And I did some crazy things there. Finally went overseas, went to China, Burma, and India. And, you know, that's really no place to send a guy who's used to drinking good booze. I'll tell you something. I'm convinced that if the American public knew what we were doing over in China, Burma, and India, World War II, they'd have bought Japanese war bonds. But anyway, I went through that campaign and came back to the States and got back, and I just couldn't wait to get discharged from the service and go back and find my niche in show business. That's a laugh. Find a niche. I had no niche. I really didn't know where I belonged. I was like a fish out of water. But anyway, I get back. I got discharged, good conduct discharge, and I'm back on the streets and back to get ready to go back in the show business. And there it was. I continued to drink for a few more years. I'm not going to get into that. I'd like to just quickly share a couple of things. As I told you that my last drunk was wound up on a Saturday night of the Kentucky Derby 30 years ago. In September of 1947, I was in Hollywood and working a nightclub there called Slapsy Maxie's. And I was staying at a hotel on Vine Street called the Hollywood Plaza, and one afternoon walking back to my hotel, I recognized a guy from his back, and he turned around and happened to be a friend of mine. And he gave me a big hello, and I gave him a big hello, and he said, what's doing? And I said, I'm in town at the club. And he said, let's go across the street and have a cup of coffee. And went over to a delicatessen, sat down to drink some coffee. And he talked about, you know, odds and ends and little trivia. And finally got up and left, and I went to the hotel. I went to the bar. I had a couple of shooters up to the room to get ready to go to work that night. Well, the rest of that week, it didn't make any difference what time I get back to the hotel. This cat, he said, just happened to be passing by. How are you, Mr. Ross? I said, fine. How are you? He said, let's go across the street and have a cup of coffee. About the third day, I said, there's something rotten here. This guy's drinking nothing but coffee, and he's got to be the worst drunk I ever met in my life. I figure, well, maybe he's fallen on hard times. He doesn't have enough money to buy a drink, you know. But then that didn't make any sense, because when he was broke, he was drunk, you know. So finally, this happened finally Friday he sprung the trap. We're sitting at the counter at this delicatessen across from the hotel. Friday, he says, you're off on Sundays, aren't you? I said, yeah. He said, you know, by this time, he's told me about some of my friends who are not drinking anymore. You know, I'll mention some of their names because they're dead now. They died sober members of AA, Frankie Marlowe and Jim Newland and a couple other guys, Eddie R., who's still around, who's now my sponsor. And he said, how would you like to see him? I said, oh, it'd be very nice. He said, well, I'll take you up Sunday. We'll go to the meeting. I said, all right. So that Sunday he came and he picked me up and he took me to the Maskers Club in Hollywood. And we walked up these steps and went in the Maskers. A guy met me at the door and shook my hand, said, welcome. I said, how are you? And we walked in, and nice room about this size. And I looked around the room. There's 50 or 60 guys sitting there, and they're all sober. They don't look too happy about it, but they're all sober, you know. There's 3 or 4 old broads there. I think Polly Hall was there, and Effie Simpson, you know. I don't think there's anybody old enough to remember either one of those names. But they were beautiful women. Yes, Mary Bell, I know you do, darling. But you were much younger then. You were beautiful. You still are. And I went in there, and I said, this is real nice. I said, I wonder what he wants me here for. I said, these old goats, you know, they got no place else to go. I'm glad they're here and keep them off the streets. And they were the worst drunks in the world that I knew of, you know. But I couldn't figure out why he wanted me there. I'm a young fella. These guys are like 45 and 50 and 55, and what the hell am I doing with this group? But there I was. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. We sat down together. And a guy got up to lead the meeting, the leader, and he was a Spaniard who played Italian parts in pictures. His name was Luis Alberni. And Louis was a beautiful man. He's also dead. He died sober. And Louis spoke with an accent, terrible accent. And he got up and he opened the meeting and he told a couple of bad jokes, and these guys laughed. And as they laughed, I said to myself, God, I said, I think they got here too late, you know. They're laughing at these bad jokes, you know. And then they did the usual thing. They read, at that time, they just had the steps, so they read the 12 steps. And then they called on a speaker, and it turned out the speaker's name was Cliff, and he was a milkman. He told a story about being a milkman. I saying to myself, well, what the hell am I doing listening to a milkman? You know, I'm usually staggering home when he's going to work. And so he tells this story and about being a milkman, and he tells about getting up one morning and getting in his truck and driving to Phoenix, and everybody laughs. And I'm wondering, you know, what the hell are they laughing about? What's so funny about a guy driving to Phoenix, you know? The fact that he lived in L.A. didn't mean anything to me. I didn't care. I figured maybe he had friends in Phoenix, you know. And they just screamed and laughed at this guy. And I looked at him and I said, these guys are definitely not playing with full decks. You know, I wanted to get out. And the meeting was over. Now I got to tell you the worst part about it. The meeting was over and they go down to the Gotham restaurant, which at that time was on the corner of Sycamore. I'm going to get help from a lot of people here tonight. You wouldn't believe I'm doing a single here, would you? Thank you, Dottie, Betty. Sycamore and Hollywood Boulevard, and we got in a semicircular booth. And they got one guy in the middle, and they're all jabbering at him. One of them says, now you don't take a drink, and here's a nickel. That's how long ago. It was a nickel with my card, and you call me up, and another one says, yeah, you do this. And one fellow said, how come you took the drink? And he said, well, so-and-so told me I couldn't be a good actor unless I had a barbaric sense of something or other. And I'm listening to this, and finally I'm saying, geez, I need a drink, you know. I can't stay. These guys are busting their chops trying to keep this guy sober. And I finally said to my friend Larry, I said, I got to go. I got to get up early in the morning. And I went down to the Roosevelt Hotel there, which was not too far away, and had myself a couple of stiff shooters, and I felt better, you know. And I got to thinking about those poor bastards. I said, gee, that's a shame, but I'm glad they got a place to go, you know. Because if you ever turn these guys loose on the street, it's got to be a disaster area in about 48 hours, you know. That was September 1947. I was appearing at Ciro's at the time, and we were doing a pretty good act there, you know, and the money was good and the booze was good. And I left town, we left town, and then my wife, oh, by the way, I told you about the vendetta I had with women. I got married 3 times whilst drunk. And when I was sober a couple of years, I said to my sponsor, I said, you know the thing I don't understand? I said, the way I didn't like women, how come I married 3 of them? Well, he said, it's very simple, Mr. Ross. He said, you were trying to get even with them. Anyhow, yeah, well, okay. So by this time, my wife was with child, and she caught me in an off moment between drinks, I guess. And in December, about the 27th or 28th of December, her what they called the water broke, and I had to rush to the Queen of Angels Hospital. And I took her up there, and they admitted her, and everything was okay. And I left, and I said to myself, how do you like that? Yeah, I'm going to have a kid. I know it's going to be a son. I couldn't, you know, God wouldn't let me have anything else, and I went out to celebrate. And that was on the 28th day of December, 1947. Now, on New Year's Eve, I was in a bar on 3rd Street in Arthur's. It was called Arthur's. And Mary R.'s first husband was a bartender there. Those you know Mary are. Her first husband was bartender, and he and I were good friends. And I'm sitting at that bar on New Year's Eve and getting blind. And he said, well, why don't you wait for me? We'll go to the house and we'll all have a drink with Mary. And I said, fine. So we waited, and we got to the house, and we got up to the apartment having a drink. And Mary said, when does the balloon go up? And I said, geez, I don't know. I said, she's at the hospital now. I said, well, I don't have a car, and I ain't gonna, you know, I'm in no condition to go this way. Al said, take my car. That'll give you an idea what kind of a condition he was in. Now, I know you've seen drunks drive down the street, you know, and they don't want anybody to know they're drunk, you know. And the only thing I can remember about where the hospital was truly was that the cab driver took us straight down Hollywood Boulevard, and all of a sudden there was a street that went that way. And I kept looking for that hill that went that way, and I found it, and I went up that hill, and lo and behold, I'm in the parking lot of Queen of Angels. And so I stagger in. It's now like 3:30 in the morning of January 2nd, and or 3 o'clock, whatever it was, and I go in there, and I tell the sister behind the desk, I said, my name is Mike Ross, and I think I'm going to be a father. And she said, go in there and wait. And I went in the next room. It was a big, long, 8-foot black couch, and I passed out on that couch. Now, the next thing I know, somebody was giving me a tug and waving a piece of paper in front of me. He said, here, sign this. I don't know what the hell that was, but I signed it and went right back out again. And the next morning, about 9:30, they woke me up, and someone said, is your name Ross? And I said, yes. Well, you come this way. And, oh, God, I felt terrible. And I went with his sister to the desk, and she said, just want to tell you that your wife has given birth to a baby boy. And I said, oh, great. She said, now you can go up and see the baby, and you can go and say hello to the waiting room at 3 in the morning. We rushed down to get you to sign the release so we could operate. If we hadn't been able to operate, you might not have had either a son or a wife. And I said, well, he kind of stopped me. He said, I suggest maybe you ought to cut down on your drink. And I said, oh, sure. So went up, and I got my wife and kid and took them home, and that was that. Now, I kept right on drinking. That was January 1948. And you'll know that 30 years ago tonight, the 5th of May, that year, it was the 7th of May, I was stoned out of my gourd. Don't even remember working. Those were my last 2 drunks. I woke up on Sunday morning, the 8th day of May, 1948, and I didn't know who the dame was in bed with me, and really didn't care to know. I wanted to get the hell out of that room because it wasn't my hotel room. And I got up and I left, and I went to my hotel, packed my bags, threw everything in a station wagon, and had to drive to Cleveland. Now, from Louisville to Cleveland is about a 400-mile trip or so. And it was a hot day in May, and I was sweating and shaking, and I want to tell you something. I think it took me 3 days to get to Cleveland that Sunday. It felt like 3 days. And I got there, and I was shaking and sweating. I had a 5th of scotch in my suitcase in the back of the wagon, which I never opened. And to this day, I cannot tell you why I did not go to that suitcase for my medicine. It was no longer medicine for me. It was no longer taking me where it used to take me. I was sick, and all I could think of was, God, I got to get back to that Sunday night meeting in Hollywood. Now, I didn't know there were meetings anywhere else. If I'd fallen down, I'd have been halfway to the city where this whole thing started, in Akron. I didn't know that the first group was in Cleveland. There I am in Cleveland. I don't know anything about it. All I know is that Sunday night meeting of the motion picture group in Hollywood. Have you ever stayed sober for 8 weeks on your own? Those were the 5 weeks I did 5 weeks in Cleveland at this hotel, and I got to work them sober, and it was terrible. And I got back to California, and I called my friend, and I said, I'm back, and I'd like to meet you to go to that Sunday night meeting, and this was a Wednesday, and he laughed. He said, just a minute, I know now what he was doing. He went to get his meeting directory and to tell me where there was a meeting that night, and I went. He told me where there was a meeting in Santa Monica. I went to that meeting, and I waited till 8:30. It was in end of June, around the 1st of July, and I went to that meeting, and I walked up and down in front of the meeting, and people were going into this American Legion Hall, and finally I looked at my watch. It was 8:30, and I went and I sat down in the last row. And as I sat there, the fella got up and you start talking, and all of a sudden 3 guys came in and sat down on the side of me, and I thought, gee, that's funny. There's a lot of empty seats up there. What the hell are they doing back here with me? And as I'm thinking about that, 3 others I turn around, there's 3 more sitting over here. And I said, well, maybe they're like me. You know, there's 7 of us, and we're brand new. We don't want to get too close to the multitude. So we sat there. That night, I was devoid of anything in my life. I was absolutely bankrupt in all departments of my life. I was mentally bankrupt, morally, physically, spiritually, any other way. The only 2 things I had going for me that really I had to hold on to was my arrogance and my hostility. And I had plenty of both. I was probably one of the most arrogant sons of whatever you want to call them you ever met in your life. I was arrogant. And I was hostile. I felt I had good reason to be hostile. And so, on top of that, my mother is now #1 on my hate parade of women. I had figured out that I'd become a victim of a disease known as my son, and I hated my mother for it. And then the rest of the women right down the line, including the broad I was married to. I wasn't too crazy about her either. And that's the condition I was in that night when I sat down at that meeting. I was to hear many times after that the expression, God in his infinite wisdom works in mysterious ways. And that night the leader did his usual thing, and he introduced a speaker, and the speaker was a little girl, about this high and about that big. And as she got up to talk, I said to myself, now I wonder what the hell she's going to tell me about drinking, you know. I probably threw up more than she drank. And she stood up and she started to talk, and I didn't know what she was talking about because she said she was a slipper, and I didn't know what a slipper was, you know, I'm new. And she talked about when she was sober and everything was lovely, and she went to church and everything was fine, and something would happen, she would get drunk, and she'd stagger in front of the church and cry because she couldn't go in. And she told that story once, and then she told it a second time. The second time she told it, I thought I was going to get sick, and I said, God, I said, I hope she doesn't tell that again. I'll have to get up and leave. And sure enough, she started, and I stood up. I said, pardon me. She said, wait. I said, he said, sit down. So I sat down. And this dame was going on and on. I figured I'll try this side. I got up. I said, excuse me, sir. She said, sit down. I sat down. I said to myself, wonder what the hell these 6 guys are doing here, you know. I know how I can leave. I put my finger down my throat, and the 7 of us will leave, you know. I looked at my watch, my sponsor, my friend, I didn't know what sponsors were then. He said, the meeting is over at 10 o'clock, and I'll see you after that. I looked at my watch, it was 9:30, and I said, oh, well, ain't too far to go, so I put my knees on my legs, and I put my chin in my hands, and I waited. And I looked at my watch about 20 minutes later, and my God, it was still 9:30. I wondered what the hell was happening. Finally, at 10 o'clock, it was all over, and I stood up, and a little guy from this side stood up, and he said, are you Mike? And I said, he said, I'm Roy. I said, how are you? And he introduced me to the other 5 guys. He said, Larry sent us up here to pick you up and bring you to the club. Now, let me explain this to you, because it's, you know, when I came in, and I'm sure when you came in, you'd hear somebody say, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous and you mentioned love, I immediately thought about sex. Well, when this guy mentioned club, all I could think about was a drink, and I really needed a drink. I said, let's go, you know. So they got me in this car, and they took me down to the 6300 Club. And as we walked into the 6300 Club, there's 7 of us. And I'm really, God, I feel awful. And a voice said, just absolutely grated on every fiber in my body, screamed out, over here, Mr. Ross, I've been waiting for you. And if anybody knows my original sponsor, they know how he sounds, you know. This guy's murder. And I went over to the table, and he shook my hand, and he said, you're not going to take another drink as long as you live. Sit down. I said, get your finger out of my chest, you know. I'll do anything you say. And I sat down and he introduced me to people. He said, Charlie, say hello to Mike Ross. He's an alcoholic. I said, how are you? Sam, meet Mr. Ross. He's not. I said, how are you? So meet Mike. He's, how are you? When the night was over, he introduced me to 60 guys the same way. Meet Mike Ross. He's an alcoholic. I'm at a meeting 2 weeks later, and some idiot who's leading a meeting says, you who are new, you are the ones who have the only right to make the decision as to whether you're an alcoholic or not. I nudged my friend. I said, he's lying. And the guy behind me said, shut up. Folks, Alcoholics Anonymous has changed a lot since those days. You know, you go to places now and you got a lot of sayings on the wall. First things first, and easy does it, and live and let live. Let me tell you about the only cliches we had when I came in. There was 2 of them. One of them was 6 words. Sit down, shut up, and listen. And the other one, if you were new, was, if your mouth is open, you're lying. Now, can you imagine some newcomer coming into this nice building and some guy getting a hold of him and said, how are you? He said, sit down and shut up and listen. The guy said, get the hell out of here. You know. He says, shut up. If your mouth is open, you're lying. Yeah, you know, you got to run him out of here. But I had no place to go. And that's the way it was when I got here. That's exactly the way it was. You know, these guys, and there was something else. God, I'll tell you, you know. There was one fellow there called the coach. His name was Cahill, Paul Cahill. Paul was a Notre Dame graduate from the University of Notre Dame. Fine golfer. Scratch golfer. Killed a man in a bar with his bare hands on Santa Monica Boulevard whilst drunk. Was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he was one of those, you talk about ego deflation at depth, you know. He was one of those, I'd walk into that club, and he'd yell, hey, actor, come here. Sit down. But Paul was one of those guys that when he talked about Alcoholics Anonymous, you had to listen. And he made his point in wonderful ways. I just want to... He talked about honesty. I got to tell you this because it's one thing I'll always remember of everything that I've heard. He would talk about honesty, and he would say, and he spoke with a New York accent you could cut with a knife, worse than mine, and he like a Damon Runyon character. And he would quote Shakespeare, and like this. He would say, to thine own self be true, and it shall follow as the night the day. And don't louse it up. There's a lot of truth in that. That was my beginning in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now I have to tell you, I got the book, and one of the smartest things I ever did in my life was when I read the book. I never realized that it was going to be the way it was. I have to tell you that I remained arrogant and I remained hostile for many years, but I picked up that book and I read it like my sponsor told me to read it right from the beginning. And I read that foreword, and in those days there was only one foreword, which says, we are 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And then in real big letters, precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. And that immediately told me that we don't play this by ear. We don't do it the way Sam, Charlie, and Mabel did it, but precisely as it is in that book. And I suppose in the beginning I read that book like many other new people. I'd read a little piece here and a little piece there in bits and pieces. And when I got to chapter 3 and I read that first paragraph, I said, God, that is really heavy. You know, many of us refuse to believe that we're real alcoholics. We refused to admit that we couldn't drink like our fellows, that we had this illusion, that we could drink like other people. And the persistence of this illusion will lead us into the gates of insanity and death. And I said, God, that's heavy, and I turned the page. And one day my eyes fell down to the next line after that first paragraph. And that's the line that blew me away. I was about 6 months, 7 months sober. And the line reads, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we're alcoholics, and this is the first step in recovery. And I looked at that again, and I said, we got 2 first steps. Nobody ever talked about them. It says here, that's the first step in recovery. And I said, when they let me talk, I had to be sober a year then, you know. I couldn't even lead a meeting. I couldn't read anything. Couldn't get to the podium until I was a year sober. I said, when they let me talk, I'm going to tell these people that there's 2 first steps. And then I was about 9 months sober, and I went to a meeting one night where I wasn't supposed to be, and a fellow by the name of Chuck C. was talking. That's why I wasn't supposed to be there. In those days, our sponsors didn't want us to go listen to him. And in his pitch, he said, he used a line. He said, we learned, and he said, the book tells us that we learned that we had to concede to our innermost selves, that we were alcoholics, and this is the first step in recovery. And I looked up at him, and I said, son of a bitch stole my line. That'll give you an idea of what they said in the chapter where they talk about the ego, that we want to be the actor, the star of the piece, the lighting director. That was me, you know. When I went, the motion picture group moved down to 6,000 Sunset and had a beautiful theater with 300 nice theater seats and a big 80-foot stage with a proscenium and the whole thing. And I looked up there and I could see me up there just spellbinding these people. God, and I read that thing and you know, about the ego. And I said, they knew about me all along. But anyway, I was to continue. I think the saving grace in my life in Alcoholics Anonymous was the fact that I continued to read that book. I just went along. I wouldn't... my sobriety was very peculiar. I knew I did not want to drink. I'd lost my obsession to drink. I knew that there wasn't anything could happen to me that a drink was going to make any better or any worse. It was just one of those things, folks. I didn't have any problem with that. You know, but then all of a sudden I remembered something they told me when I was new, and it was beginning to happen. Every time he'd see me, he'd say, how do you feel? I said, I feel fine. He said, good, hold on to it. It's going to get worse. And it got worse. Now, it got worse when I found out booze wasn't my problem. Now, you who are new, you wait till you look in the mirror someday and find out you're not drinking and things ain't going well. You know. And you got to remember that we didn't promise you a rose garden here. You know. All we said to you is that if you come to Alcoholics Anonymous and don't drink, you'll stay sober. It's not a panacea for everything in life. Anyway, I found out that things got worse. I didn't want to meet people. I didn't want to know people. I really didn't. I was the kind of a guy I stayed strictly with the 8 or 9 guys that I met when I came in. There was Eddie and Larry and Frank and a few of the others, and that was it. I would go to meetings at North Hollywood. I walked in there. I'd been going there for 2 years, and I'd walk in and walk right through the coffee room and get coffee. And invariably somebody would say, aren't you going to say hello? And I said, oh, I didn't see you. How are you? And get my coffee and split into the other room. You see, I didn't come here to meet to make friends. I really didn't. I had enough friends where I came from. And one night, I tell these 2 quick stories because it'll tell you what kind of a guy I was. See, my sponsor had said, if you were a thief when you were drinking, you'll be a better thief sober. I have to believe that. You know, now when I came in here, you know, whatever I was, I just didn't know. I was a snob to start with. I think I was born a snob. Because I came, at North Hollywood is my home group now, and on a Tuesday night they had a beginner's meeting, and you get up and speak for 2 or 3 minutes. So I get up there one Tuesday night, and all of a sudden the thought struck me, you know, that I wouldn't have gotten drunk with these people. And I said, you know, I wouldn't have gotten drunk with half you idiots. And I finished saying what I had to say, and I sat down, and after the meeting, a friend of mine said, you know, maybe half these people wouldn't have gotten drunk with you. I said, well, great, we got a Mexican standoff. Who cares, you know? I didn't care. Another time, I'm the same thing. A Tuesday night, I'm up at the podium, and I'm talking. I'm making a little 3-minute, 4-minute pitch, and I said something about sickness of being sick, and a friend of mine in the bank, and he was a friend of mine, laughingly yelled out. He said, "You're sick." I said, "You're right, I am sick." I said, "I'm sick of you and you and you and you." So help me, I pointed my finger at the people I was really sick of, and they all laughed. And I said, "These people are nuttier than fruitcakes. They think I'm kidding, and I'm really sick of these people." Now I'm going to say something that's going to sound surprising, but I wouldn't give my first 10 years of sobriety to my worst enemy. I was only sober. I was making 12-step calls, and I was washing cups and making coffee and doing those things, but other than that, pass, you know. How hostile was I? It took me 22 years to go to a convention. That's right. And the first convention I went to wasn't even the Southern California Convention. It was in Houston in June of 1970. I went to Houston on business, and I got sucked into going to a convention because my associate there's wife was a member, erstwhile member of AA, sober 3 months, drunk 3 months, sober 3, and he figured, you know, isn't that the usual thing? 90 days sober, 90 days drunk, and finally they either die or make it. And she was still alive when I was there in June of 70. And he knew I had a lot of time on the program, and we went to a meeting one night, his wife and I, we came home, and she said, "Oh, by the way, there's a convention in town." And I said, "What kind of a convention are you talking about?" And she said, "AA convention." I said, "Oh, my God." Charlie said, "I'll go down. We'll go down and get the tickets tomorrow." Tomorrow was Thursday. And so we go down to the Shamrock Hotel, and it's a long table there with a lot of stuff. I'd never seen anything like this in my life. And there was flyers, and there was magazines, and all kinds of literature, and there was praying hands, and kneeling knees, and lighters, and, you know, I never saw so much, you know, and everything for sale, you know. And he's filling out the registrations, and I look at a flyer, and on the flyer it says the featured speakers are Chuck C. Laguna B., Elsa C. Laguna B., and Eddie C. from the valley down below, and Lorraine C. And I said, "Hey, friends of mine are here speaking here." And as I turned this way, the four of them came down the hall. I don't know who was more surprised, they or me. Because Eddie knew I never went to conventions. He said, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but here I am." And we hugged and we kissed, and I never was so happy to see anybody in my life. I have to tell you about that convention because it changed my life. There are not many people in this room tonight who knew me prior to 1970. But in June 1970, on a Thursday night, I heard a man from Pompano Beach, Florida, talk by the name of Wesley P. Now, I've heard people talk about miracles happening. And as this man talked, I began listening, and later on it was with a whole different attitude. And I began crying. And when the meeting was over, I wanted to meet this man. I'd never felt this way before in my life in Alcoholics Anonymous. What it was, I began to feel the thing that I'd heard a lot of people talking about. The thing they'd been talking about was the love that permeated the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous the world over, and I had never felt any love in these rooms prior to that Thursday night in Houston. And when the meeting was over, I walked up to Wesley and I introduced myself to him, and I told him how much I enjoyed listening to him. And we talked for a few minutes, and he left, and Eddie took a hold of me, and he introduced me to a little guy from Dallas by the name of David A., a drunken dentist. He said, "I want you to meet Super Jew." And by this time, I was feeling better, and I said, "You've already met Super Jew. Here I am, you know." And he introduced me to David A. Quickly, let me tell you that for the rest of that convention, I made every meeting. I had feelings like I'd never experienced before in Alcoholics Anonymous.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think.
And all of a sudden on Sunday, everybody is running here and there. I said, what's happening? And he said, it's over. I said, everybody's going home. I said, when's the next convention? They said, the next one is next June. I said, where? They said, Fort Worth. I said, I'll be there. They said, all right, we'll see you. They must have thought I was nutty in a fruitcake. I came back to California, never said a word to anybody. June 1971, I'm on a balloon to Dallas. By this time, I've made some conversation with David A., and he knows I'm coming. He met me there, and I went to the convention at Fort Worth in 1971. And I came back from that convention, and I was so full of love and a whole new feeling. I felt like a whole new man. I came back, and I went down to see my present sponsor, Eddie, and I said, I got to talk to you. And he was alone in his place of business. He said, what is it? I said, I've been to a convention. He said, yeah. I said, I've been to 2 conventions. He said, so? I said, I went last year to Houston to the Texas State, and I just came back from the Texas State in Fort Worth. He said, that's nice. I said, Eddie, why didn't you tell me about these conventions? He said, tell you what? I said, well, now I'm trouble. I said, how do I make up for all the years that I did all the things I did and didn't go? And he said, what do you want to make up for what? He said, you don't have to make up for it. I said, why didn't you tell me? I said, why didn't you tell me what a nut, what a jerk I was? He said, what right do I have to deprive you of your pain and suffering? But there it was. And the miracle of miracles is that I've been involved in conventions ever since. And I have to tell you, I wouldn't have it any other way. I found the love that you talked about in these rooms, in Southern California, in Orange County, in L.A., in Beverly Hills. I found it in Ventura, in Santa Barbara, in Bakersfield. I have friends today, people I've known for years, that I can only say we've been friends for only the past 8 years, because it's really been the only past 8 years that they've known me. I've got 2 sons, both of them were in the drug scene. One of them came out of it real good and is doing fine. And the oldest one, the one that was born that night, January of '48, got hooked on Valium when he was 14. And did a lot of time in prison and jails. A little over 2 years ago, he deliberately tried to kill himself and OD'd. His landlady found him, and I was notified. Went down to USC. And that night, I'd taken him home. I told him, I said, I love you. I said, you're my son. But we're through, I said, you and I are finished. I said, there's nothing I have for you except my love. You got to go find your own way. And that was, as I said, a little over 2 years ago. December 24th of 1977, he went to an AA meeting. He stayed sober and clean for about 2 months. And one Friday, he, I guess something, whatever hit him, and he went out and he got loaded. And he called his sponsor the next day and told him about it, and he came back to meetings. He's now sober and clean 90 days. I've been blessed. God's been good to me. God's given me a way to go that I never knew before. I have my self-respect is probably the greatest thing I have that I value the most, because you allowed me to get it because of the fact that I began to respect the ladies and gentlemen of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I now am in a position where I can stand up and be a credit to the community in which I live because I live in it. be a credit to the community in which I work because I work in it. I don't really know what else I can tell you except that for me it's been a tremendous journey. Everything I read in the book has come to pass. And they told me that if I would do the things that I'm supposed to do, that I would come to know heaven on earth. I would come to know that all the promises that the book makes me will come true, providing I do these things painstakingly, which I try to do. I try to be responsible, and I am responsible, to be of service and to be available to carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. And to paraphrase a friend of mine, if you were to ask me what I have found in Alcoholics Anonymous since I came here 30 years ago, I would tell you that I have found that the blind do see, the lame do walk, the lepers are cleansed and rise and will rise again, and that I only hope that it will last, that through the longest day and the darkest night, that we will come to know that these things will come to pass for all of us. And I'm deeply grateful for being given the opportunity to be a member of our society. I want to thank Chuck and Dottie for having me here tonight, and I want to thank all of you for being here, making a 12-step call on me. Thank you.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.